Marge, it's finally time I told you a terrible secret from my past. I do not like Pixar's bow. I don't like it. I don't like it. I'm gonna start it off with a stupid reason, so that you guys will be like, oh, okay, he's just being petty, so I don't need to listen to his opinions. This is a stupid video. Just because, he doesn't like things getting eaten, so it's like, yeah. And it's like, I would be okay if, like, she bit his head first and then made him brain dead. If they kill them first, then they eat them. It's better, because at least I know they're not suffering. That sounds like a small distinction, but it is, and at least they didn't go with the choice that they were originally going to do, which I also would have said kudos to them if they were going to do it, because I'd respect them for that. Like, I respect the original Oven Break for being incredibly gory, but yeah, the original thing was actually going to show her just chewing her dumpling son, and it would have been very intense, and that would have been quite a lot. So I'm glad that wasn't the case. Although I still find it very disturbing because to me it just feels like, why don't you just throw up? You regretted it immediately after. Just like instantly regretted it. Because apparently the director is just like, oh, it was supposed to be an act of primal love. And it's like, she wasn't thinking, it was just it's more like primal abuse, and that's part of getting into the next thing. Um, my actual problems with it. But it's just like, that was supposed to be the intended reason. It's just like, well, if you love the thing, just throw up again. Just go over to a toilet, gag your mouth, throw up, and then there you go. You know? Still alive. You just ate the dumpling baby whole. You just, I mean, I don't even think that she had even, she barely chewed. Maybe she broke its skull and it died. Maybe that was the case, but even then you could throw it up and give it a proper burial, you know? Um, from what I had read of the director, now we're going into the actual problems. The thing was just like, oh, the mom being like, oh, I wish I could just put you back inside me sometimes when the mom was angry. So I think the director had a bit of a messed up, like, sense of what love is. Um, so when they made this short, they didn't quite understand. Because that isn't primal. That isn't an act of primal love. That's an act of primal abuse. That's the equivalent of, like, hurting your child. It's like when Homer would, in The Simpsons, Homer would strangle the kids, not because it was premeditated, but they always wanted to make sure that it was Homer just being stupid and doing it very fast, without thinking at all, because he was an idiot. He was supposed to represent, like, a lot of the problems that end up underlying in a lot of American society and society as a whole, but especially American society at the time, that a lot of people would be underlying and not really thinking about, because they would just imagine it being like, oh, father knows best and stuff like that. And so the point of Homer being a cartoon character is that it would be exaggerated. It wouldn't actually be, like, very serious. It wouldn't actually, like, seriously hurt anybody. Um, it was just more, being cartoony, just to express the emotion of it, as opposed to being an actual thing that somebody would do. It was never intended to be real. And Homer never premeditates it. He never plots on loving the idea of strangling Bart. It's just that he will get angry and then he'll do that, but he'll never kill him. And they made sure to show that numerous times in at least the early Simpsons, that Homer would not want to kill him. He still loves his son. Like, he wouldn't, like, he'd still sacrifice his hair, despite being how selfish Homer can be. He still loves his son enough to not, to like, fight back against Snake in the Treehouse of Horror, which, even though that's not canon, it's still part of, like, his personality, and that's what makes him so strong as a character. Or, like, jumping the gorge, he doesn't want Bart to jump because he wants him to be safe and stuff like that. So it's like, Homer is supposed to be meant. Homer is supposed to meant. I can't speak. Homer is supposed to be a highlight highlighter yellow, if you will, of the underlying problems that often happen. But the fact that he still tries to be a good person was supposed to represent the fact that we can still move past that. We can still be better no matter how bad that we are, and we can still improve ourselves. That's what Homer is as a character, because despite all of his flaws and despite all of the terrible things that he'll do, he still ultimately wants to be a better person, or at least he wants to be a good person and still wants to do the right thing. And that's extra highlighted with other characters. Barney was supposed to highlight, like, what could happen to Homer if he just completely gave in to all of his urges and didn't care about anything else, and he was just, like, even lower. And Mr. Burns is, well, he was also, comment on capitalism, but is like, premeditatively evil. In addition to other characters who are just very calculated in their evil and stuff like that, whereas Homer is just an idiot and a product of growing up in such a messed up world. And they want to try and do that with Bao, but they don't, because the mom is kind of like awful. She's kind of still awful to the son, and it's just kind of like, oh, okay, well, she doesn't really know too much better. She just kind of does things without really thinking too much. She just kind of acts the way that she acts, and it's supposed to be like her second chance at having a son, because she messed things up with the first son and was a little bit prejudiced, towards the other person in his life, and like, what's so frustrating is that the mom never seems to apologize, because the mom just kind of goes and is just crying, and it's the son who has to comfort her. And I know what they're trying to do. They're trying to have it be like, oh, the son is still the better man, and she has her own ways of apologizing, which is why she kind of helps him to learn how to cook, or possibly it's implied that she's learned to turn around. But the problem is the way that it actually lands towards people, because the parents that actually need to hear the lesson of Bao are not going to have that self-reflection, because it's meaningful to the kids who have gone through these situations, because it's just like, oh, we've been through these terrible situations and these parents being awful, and that's part of what makes it so emotional, and that's what makes people cry, but I don't think they understand why they're crying. And just mentioning, oh, by the way, abusive family, you have been noticed. If that's enough to make you cry, that doesn't mean that that sentence is an absolute work of art. It's just emotions that you feel. Because they kind of, the way that the thing is implied, it's trying to be like, oh yeah, she's not perfect, but she's going to try and be a little bit better, even though in reality most of the time that isn't the case. I really wish it would have been more like, it happens, and then she tries to do more instead of the son just coming back and having it be more on the son as an onus, because it kind of feels more like, oh, your parents abused you, but they probably feel bad about it now, so you should go over there and talk to them again and make up, and everything will be fine. They'll want to learn and work to be better. No, that's not really how it works. Like 90%, excuse me, of the time. And it's like, I don't think that they really understood. I don't think they really understood it. And what's worse is that so often those parents who need the lesson will then turn to the kids and scream, "See, look," and they'll try and shame their kids to be like, "See, no matter what I do, you have to love me, you have to forgive me," and that's even worse, because that's the kind of stuff that would happen all the time when you'd see these messages in so many of these shows that would just be like, oh, your parents messed up, but they love you after all. It's one of the things that I really hated about Good Luck Charlie. I know it's basically a sin to say that you don't like Good Luck Charlie, but I hated the parents in Good Luck Charlie, because no matter what the kids did to learn from or make up for their mistakes, or even if they didn't learn and they still just tried to get away with something, they would always be so upset. They would never be understanding. They would always punish them, and they were treated like they were in the right, by the way. Even though sometimes the parents would be like, oh, look how stupid they can be, or Peter, but they're still good in the end because they're your parents. And it's just like, I hated that so much. As it's like, why bother like they'd get grounded every single time, but the kids would never learn a lesson because that was the way that they just acted in any situation. And of course, again, there's not literally every single time, because there was the one time that like the kids were so scared that they were going to be punished because they like spilled either like ice cream or a drink on the sofa, and they shouldn't have been eating on the sofa, that they like spent all of their money buying a brand new sofa. And like the dad is supposed to be so stupid that he didn't realize it, and the mom realized it and was a jerk about it. And that was the only time they didn't get punished, because I think she was just like, "You're lucky that I like the color," or something like that. And that's not fun. And like the laugh track rolls, and it's just like, "Excuse me, this is not funny. This is awful." I'm getting a little sidetracked, but yeah. So it kind of feels like Bao is telling you that this is what you're supposed to be feeling, and this is what it's trying to say, but the actual text and the way that it actually lands to people doesn't really it doesn't really connect, because anything just mentioning how, oh yeah, parents abusive, that's enough to make you be like, oh, I know that feeling, and that makes me emotional. But it's like, no, 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 do better. Do better, Pixar. Please understand the material better, and don't try and make it seem like it's the victim's fault to, excuse me, it's on the victim to apologize for the abuser, because they might not realize it, even though they kind of, already knew the whole time. And even after, you never see that the mom apologizes. She just kind of acts in a way that sort of tolerates the kid. And it's like, that's so easy to misinterpret, especially for the people who need that lesson the most. You're not converting people with stuff like this. You're not making people into better people. You're just adding fuel for the worst people to hurt the better people. Unless you make something that directly calls them out specifically, and they have to like. There's no way that they could really turn it around on the other one, on whoever they're hurting. Like, it's just, it would have been so much better if the mom was just crying, realizing what she had done and had ruined her life, even after she had a second chance. Honestly, even though, for my own personal reasons, I wouldn't have liked to watch it, I still think that her chewing the dumpling baby would have shown, like, that would have been more metaphorical to what she has done. And it could have, instead of it being like a second chance at parenthood, it could have been like a second way of showing how all these little terrible actions that she would have done throughout their life would have damaged the kid. Like, let's say the mom ends up keeping the kid on, a tight leash, and the kid doesn't like it, and then the little dumpling baby gets visibly more bruised and battered, and you can see more and more of like the grossness that ends up like affecting the little soul of this thing, but it still tries to fight and march on. And like, you could have had it like be scratched up and bruised and stuff like that, all like during the things that the mom does that are very hurtful, and it would have been more metaphorical, where it's just like, oh, that thing's scratched because it's dumpling, it doesn't really heal. And it would have been a metaphor for, the thing, the soul of the thing. And it's it's I think people let the mom off the hook a little bit too easy, because even if it's supposed to be a metaphor and she didn't have a literal dumpling baby, I, I guess it would have been self-reflection, and then she would have just been crying. Um, but if it was literal, and she literally had a magical dumpling baby come back to her, that thing is basically a human, but it's made of dumpling. That mom is a murderer. We're just gonna let her off the hook for that? She just murdered a child. We just gonna overlook that? Just gonna let her off the hook because she's preparing food later? Just gonna forget the fact that she literally just murdered a baby? That's one of the worst things you can do as a person. It sucks. The whole thing sucks. and it's trying to be something good. But when you end up making something that can hurt, because I've heard stories of people who's used that to hurt people, and it's like, you could have made something better that would have brought up the emotions that wouldn't have ended up hurting people. And maybe, just maybe, you could also make it by thinking about how, like, oh, maybe I'll make something that's meant to connect to the people who need to hear it the most. I mean, that's part of why that Frank Grimes episode of The Simpsons is often considered like the best one, because it reaches people. It reached the people that it needed to get to the most, whether you were on Frank Grimes' side or Homer's side, where it's just like, oh yeah, Frank Grimes subscribed to all of the what do you call it? There was a really good video by Renegade Cut where it's like the cult of work essentially, and even if you like were able to sympathize with Homer for the rest of the time, and you're on his side, excuse me, I don't know what I'm saying. Regardless of whether you were on Frank Grimes' side and being like, oh, I put in lots of work and yet people still seem to be getting away with stuff, something doesn't seem right about that, versus being on Homer's side where it's just like, oh yeah, he's carefree and because the system is extremely corrupt, and Frank Grimes and Homer just doesn't care, and Homer's life is a whole lot easier because he's not playing by the rules of the system even if he doesn't know it. And that's the only way to be able to get by in such a corrupt world. Meanwhile, Frank Grimes keeps believing the lies, and rather than trying to go with the flow and be more chill like Homer, he doubles down and gets more upset. And eventually, the constant listening to the lies ends up doing him in. Either way you slice it, that episode really affects a lot of people because it makes them understand, it makes them look around and be like, oh, that's a thing that's happening in the world, regardless of whichever side that we're on. And it really moves people because you can't ignore one of the two sides, at least when you watch it. It's an experience that's able to just completely move you and still be funny and still be memorable and still be entertaining and still be interesting and still be a good thing in addition to commentary. And it's like, Bao is none of those things, but it says that it is, and it wants to be, and it kind of shows some of the steps, but because it doesn't go all the way, it kind of doubles back and ends up being worse because it doesn't go further. But of course, Disney isn't going to be like, oh, abusive parents. No, 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 no. They're just misunderstood. Um, which is a shame because, they totally can with lots of evil parents, like the evil step parents in, whatchamacallit, in Cinderella. Like, they're okay with showing some parents being awful, awful people and then getting comeuppance. When I say Disney, I don't mean Disney as a whole. I just mean stupid Disney. Even though this is Pixar, it doesn't make sense. But you get what I'm saying, right? Where it's just like, oh no no, because the parents are gonna take you to the movie. They're the ones that have the money. That you can't insult the parents too much. That's why it always has to be some other evil entity or some other person who's just like, oh, they're well, like the Nostalgia Critic's Lorax review. Oh, don't worry, I could never be that evil. They're evil. You're good. And it's stuff like that. It's like, uh, wait, don't go to the Nostalgia Critic for deep, meaningful movie analysis, but he's very entertaining. I subscribe to Oni Plays, uh, what do you call it? Interpretation of him, where he's either perfect cringe and that's entertaining, or sometimes he actually says something that's either memorable or kind of funny or really good, and he'll sometimes be legitimate. But if you want like really deep, meaningful analysis, go to some other people. It's just impressive that he makes as much as he does in like a week. I don't mind. Again, there's other things about that. In terms of me saying media analysis, again, I don't want you to think that it's just like, oh, that's the peak. It's just something memorable. That's actually something else where it's like part of why the Nostalgia Critic, and you know what, I'll even kind of lump in Hasanabi. Part of why they're so effective at what they do is the fact that it's able to. Not everybody is gonna. Ooh, excuse me. Not everybody is able to sit down and listen to. Um, better analysis of stuff. It might be a little bit too cerebral. So even though their kinds of things are not the best, they're very gripping. They're able to grab you. And people who tend to not think any differently about things and just absorb stuff, they'd hear like Hasanabe say something, and it's just like, whoa, what? This isn't stuff that I understood before. Even if, he has his own mistakes. He could easily say things better. Have you all seen the whole issue with JXE where he just would not, he would rather just destroy a thing rather than apologizing? He has his own flaws, but that doesn't mean that he's not ultimately a force of good. And like with the Nostalgia Critic, like, he was one of the initial inspirations for me to think deeper, and that was like something that I've left behind now in the past, because I can analyze things and do deeper analysis better. But it's very good when you have no base for anything, and it's very gripping. And Bao is not that. I get better media emotion. I get more emotions out of a Nostalgia Critic episode than I do Bao, because Bao kind of fails at the message that it's trying to do. And Bao is not an ultimate source of good in the world. Bao has caused extra grief for people who have listened to it. Maybe there are some people who have been able to balance it out and made it a neutral force, because after seeing Bao, it's moved them enough to want to seek therapy, but they should not reopen past dangerous relationships either, because a Pixar short made them feel emotions and kind of made them want to go back into that. Sometimes things you should just leave behind, maybe, just a little bit. So those are my thoughts on there. Feel free to yell at me in the comments and say if you disagree or not, or get hooked up on one of the side tangents that I've said as well. Just because this video was an act of primal love. I just did it fast without really writing a script or thinking about anything. I hope this was at least interesting. I hope that maybe some of you can relate. I hope some of you can at least understand where I'm coming from. To be like, oh, I'm not going to try and forgive certain really terrible people for being terrible, especially if they don't really do that much to kind of show it and still act terribly. Because it's like, yeah, I know it's supposed to make up for it, which they're supposed to represent, like, oh, she might have been doing more things to be better. But A, again, that doesn't always happen. And B, most of the time those kinds of people don't really feel that way. And C, even if it's just, she could also be just doing it to act like she's being nice, just so that she isn't completely alone and doesn't actually feel those feelings anymore. Hence why she can't even apologize. I think a lot of people who are broken will listen and see Bao and take the wrong message from it because they don't have enough in them already. And for people who are broken, those kinds of emotions are not what you should be reinforcing in people. You need to reinforce, like, the kids moving on and stuff from the kids' perspective, and not act like the abusive mom is just a normal mom who messed up a little bit but is trying. That's not the case. And I feel bad if the people making it didn't realize that, because they all have had their own issues and are just like, oh yeah, the parent ends up forgiving them. That's like what they would want in their heart, and they kind of like. I'm just rambling at this point. I'm gonna wrap this up here. Thank you for listening. I appreciate you taking the time to hear my hot takes, and I will hope that some people were able to get something out of it. And if your life ended up having a bit of a rough day because your parent decided to use that against you when you were watching it, then I hope that this video itself is actually a little reach out to be like, hey, you're noticed. So that's my hot takes, and sorry I ate your soaps.